To the feature presentation today, I'd like to invite Dr. Breezy Okeana Flacker to just say a few words and introduce who the Caribbean Astronomy for Inclusion is. Thank you. Over to you, Breezy.
Thank you, Shirin. And Ben, thank you very much for talking to us about the deaf community in the Caribbean as a team. We are a group of astronomers from the Caribbean region, and we are working on making astronomy more accessible for the general public, for students, or for future astronomers, people who are interested in science, but are finding it difficult to, with the system, to be able to reach their goal. And in this case in particular, we're targeting or trying to understand ourselves, the deaf community in the Caribbean as a team, so that we can work together. So thank you very much for your time.
So who is Dr. Ben Braithwaite? So let me introduce him for our audience. Dr. Ben Braithwaite he's a lecturer in linguistics in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad, where he is also the coordinator of the Diploma in Caribbean Sign Language Interpreting. He has conducted research and published on sign languages and deaf communities around the Caribbean. He works alongside Caribbean deaf organizations and deaf researchers with the goal of producing research which supports the goals of deaf communities. So folks, it's my great pleasure to pass it over now to Dr. Ben Braithwaite to speak to us about Caribbean deaf communities and Caribbean Sign Languages. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. Hopefully everybody can see my slides here, my rather boring first slide. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Caribbean deaf communities and Caribbean Sign Languages. In some ways, what I'm going to try to do is condense the research I've been doing for the last 15 years or so into, I'm aiming for about 45 minutes maybe. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we know about Caribbean Sign Languages, some of the things that we don't know or that have not been subject to a great deal of research, some of the things which I consider to be mistakes made in the past, and some opportunities for the future. I think it's important with the kind of research that I do, I think it's important to be quite explicit about myself, my own background, who I am, because I think my positionality and my identity does affect the kind of work that I do. It affects the kind of relationships that I have. So I am, as you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm from England, grew up in London. I have a PhD in linguistics. I've been working at the University of the West Indies since 2007. I'm hearing, I'm not deaf. My relationship with deaf communities is professional through my research. It's also personal. I first learned a sign language back in about 2001. I learned Japanese sign language. So I've had and that was for personal reasons. And so I have both personal and professional ties to the deaf community, to various deaf communities. So going back to my early time in Trinidad, when I first came to Trinidad, around that time, a few interesting things were happening in terms of the deaf community there. There was a dictionary project which was run through the Ministry of Social Development to produce a dictionary of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language called A Melting Pot of Signs. That worked in collaboration with various deaf organizations from around the country. And also there was a diploma in Caribbean Sign Language Interpreting, actually developed by Dr. Karen Cumberbatch, who's in the meeting now. She had developed this really quite innovative, revolutionary program. So I was saying that in addition to this dictionary of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, there's this new program run through the University of the West Indies, a diploma in Caribbean Sign Language Interpreting. And so as I started to get involved in the deaf community in Trinidad, as I started to take an interest in these things, I had a few questions. And two of my first questions were, well, what really is Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language? What is that language? Who uses it? Where does it come from? What does it look like? Is it related to other languages? I came knowing nothing at all. So I came with some very basic questions. And then the Diploma in Caribbean Sign Language Interpreting. I think the name can be interpreted a couple of different ways. It could be interpreted as implying the existence of a language called Caribbean Sign Language. And I wondered, is that a language? And if so, what is it? And who uses it again? And what's its history? And all of those kinds of questions. So those were my initial guiding questions. And I want to take you through what I did to try to find out answers to those questions and what the answers I found were. So the dictionary of TTSL has an introduction to it. And in that introduction, it says something about the history of signing and the deaf community. And it says that American Sign Language was introduced to the School for the Deaf in 1976 from America. And it says that prior to that, deaf people communicated by gestures, mimes, facial expressions, reading, writing, lip reading. To me, at least, that seems very strongly to be implying that there was no sign language in Trinidad and Tobago prior to the introduction of American Sign Language. And I was curious about that. And as I started to meet deaf people in the community, take part in organizations, make friends, that kind of thing, many deaf people told me that that was not correct. They told me that was not true. They told me that there was a sign language prior to American Sign Language, and in fact that it still exists. And I noticed that there was a kind of a difference between what some of the hearing sign language interpreters were telling me and some of the teachers in the school were telling me and what some of the deaf people were telling me. So I wanted to look into that. And I guess the approach that I have always taken with these things, I like to keep in mind this quote from the famous Trinidadian philosopher, economist Lloyd Best, who in a speech talking about research in the Caribbean, he said, I want you to describe what you see, tell me how it works, what it is, and theorize on the basis of what is in front of you. This might seem like obvious things to do, but the reason he's saying this is because he observes that sometimes in the Caribbean, what we do is we import our theories or import our assumptions or import our solutions to problems from elsewhere. And when we do that, they don't necessarily fit. Our theories developed elsewhere don't necessarily fit the Caribbean. Assumptions made elsewhere don't necessarily fit the Caribbean. And solutions to problems that other people have are not necessarily good Caribbean solutions. So I wanted to see what was in front of us. How were deaf people communicating in Trinidad and Tobago? What did it look like? How did it work? So one of the first things that I was involved in was a project with deaf researchers and some hearing collaborators. And we made recordings from all around Trinidad and Tobago, just over 80 deaf people from all over the country, all parts of the country. The deaf researchers went to people's houses, met them in different places, and made recordings. The recordings included lexical elicitation, i.e. collecting words. How do you sign this? How do you sign that? And also conversations, free conversations, so that you could get a sense not just of individual words, but of grammar. And we found that one of the things that immediately jumped out was that there were big differences in the way people signed, depending on their age. That older people signed very differently from younger people. And I've got a very simple example here. This is when we ask people to show how would they sign the number 3. And what you'll see is that the people, the oldest generation, the people who are over 70, sign differently from the people who are in the middle generation, currently about 50 to 70 years old, and they sign differently from the people in the youngest generation. So if you look at the top row here, you see the oldest signers, and they're signed for 3 here. You can see a couple of things. The back of the hand is facing forward, and they have 3 fingers up, the index, the middle, and the ring finger. And then if you look down at the middle generation, you'll see that it looks similar, but instead of having the ring finger up, that's down, and the thumb is sticking out. So the hand shape is different. And then you look at the younger generation, and the orientation of their sign is different. That is to say, rather than the back of the hand facing forward, the front of the hand faces forward. And this seemed to be representative of a systematic pattern, that it's not just that this is an illustrative example, but this was something that we saw again and again. I'll give you another just very short example of 2 signs with the same meaning used by different people. So first of all, on the left of your screen here, this is a sign meaning school. And then on the right of your screen, this is another sign meaning school. So hopefully you can see that. And the most important point is you can see they're different, and that older people are signing differently from younger people. So the next question was, well, why? Why is that happening? What does that mean? How do we interpret that? And I found that the best way of understanding that is to speak to people about their experiences, especially to older people, their experiences at school, their experiences learning to sign, their experiences of seeing how sign language has changed over their lifetimes. And so I have a short extract from an interview here from an older signer, Lorna, talking about sign language variation. Okay, so what you can see there, Lorna described differences. She described 2 different ways of signing, the Trinidadian way and the American way. And she contrasted them, and she gave some examples. And she talked about how she signed when she was at school. She mentioned Cascade School for the Deaf. And that, I think, holds the answer. Understanding the history of Cascade School for the Deaf and deaf education helps us to understand where these differences come from. So this is a picture of the first school for the deaf in Trinidad and Tobago, Cascade School for the Deaf. It's still here. This was not long after it was established. This picture was from 1949. So the first kind of generations of deaf kids in the deaf school. Prior to this, there wasn't any deaf school. Deaf kids didn't come together in one place. But before this, as far as we know. So they came together in this deaf school, not just actually from Trinidad and Tobago, but there were kids from St. Vincent, from Barbados, from Guyana, I think Grenada too. In the school, the way that they taught in the early years was imported from outside, imported from England. As you can see in this picture, The teacher would have a microphone. The deaf children would wear headphones. The teacher would speak into this, and the deaf children would be encouraged to try to understand what the teacher was saying, to try to make use of whatever residual hearing they may have, and also to develop speech. And sign language in the early years was also banned. And that was enforced through, physical violence in the traditional way. You get licks if you caught signing. But despite this, even the teachers were aware that it was not really working. So the quote that I have on here is from the first principal of the School for the Deaf in Trinidad. She had also worked at the School for the Deaf in Jamaica. And she said that she could see that some of the students have evolved such a system of signing that teaching lip reading is a hopeless task. So the kids, whether you wanted them to or not, they started signing anyway. You can imagine in the dormitories after class, deaf children spending all this time together are not going to try to speak to each other when they can't hear each other. They're going to find other ways to communicate. They did. They found visual ways to communicate. And from that, developed a new language, a new sign language. So these children here created their own language. And that was later passed on through the school and then outside in the deaf community. And of course, like every language, it's changed and grown in various ways. We've done research on the structure of that language, and you can see its grammar. You can see that its grammar is different. It's not just words, it's not just signs, but it's grammar and structure and all of that. All of that emerged out of those children and out of that community. So when American Sign Language was brought, actually in 1975, I think, when American Sign Language and a code called Signing Exact English were brought to Trinidad, there was something there already. There was a sign language there already. The teachers may not have been very aware of it, and it may have been mostly a language used by deaf people, deaf children, and those children who had now left school and were now adults, but it existed. And so by understanding this history, by understanding people's experiences, by looking at the language and by listening to what people say about what actually happened, we can give a kind of answer to my question about, well, what is this TTSL, Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language? And that answer is not the same answer as the one in the dictionary. I think TTSL is the language. I mean, language naming is always political. It's always a political matter, and different people give different names to different languages and they split things up differently. But at least I think there is somewhat of a consensus, at least amongst the leaders of deaf organizations in Trinidad and Tobago now, that what we call Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, we can say that that was the language first created in that school for the deaf by those deaf children and passed down through the deaf community. And of course, a lot has happened since it's come into contact with American Sign Language, and we can study all of those things. So that's my little summary of the first question. So what is Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language? Then I began to ask myself, what about the rest of the Caribbean? What about Caribbean Sign Language? What else is going on in the rest of this, huge and diverse region? And again, for reasons of time, I want to leave some time for questions and discussions at the end. So I'm going to try not to go on for too long, but I want to give you just 3 short examples of situations where I've done some work in other parts of the Caribbean. And I've decided to talk about a situation in Guyana, one in Providence Island, Colombia, and one in the Bay Islands of Honduras. So 2 in the Western Caribbean there, and then Guyana. So I'm going to turn to Guyana first. And the first thing to know about Guyana is that there are many different signing traditions, different ways of signing in Guyana. Certainly, there is American Sign Language. There are quite a few missionaries who brought American Sign Language to Guyana, and it's been used in the deaf school in Georgetown. People also talk about Guyanese Sign Language as well. Again, mostly people in Georgetown talk about Guyanese Sign Language. And then there are other small sign languages that have developed in different communities, mostly in indigenous communities, outside of the coast, outside of the capital. I'm going to talk about Falmouth Sign Language a little bit. And then in addition to that, I have no doubt that there are quite a number of other signing traditions in Guyana in addition. And there are international sign languages like Libras, a Brazilian sign language, Venezuelan sign language. There are people moving backwards and forwards across borders. So there's more going on than this. The picture that you can see on the left here is a group of UE students. In 2018, we made a field trip to Guyana with the Deaf Association of Guyana, and we visited a village called Falmouth, close to the town of Bartica. And in that village, there are many deaf people. There's genes for deafness, so many deaf people within an extended family. There were 4 generations of people signing, deaf and hearing people signing. So it's not just the deaf people that sign in the village, but also the hearing people too. And I'll just show you what it looks like. This was the kind of patriarch of the community who is in the middle of the video here, and he's talking about his life when he was a boy, when he lived in another part of Guyana. So there's a whole fascinating story. His life is an amazing story. And it really spanned a lot of very major changes in Guyana, especially in his communities. Anyway, you could see him signing there. The other people sitting with him are part of his family related to him. They're also deaf, they're also signers. I'm now going to show you a short video. This is my colleague on the left there, Ian Danulal, who is a deaf researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. And he's doing an interview here with Ronaldo, who is from Falmouth. And again, this will give you just a flavor of the language situation. Okay, there you go. So the purpose of me showing you that one is to show, well, this is a bilingual situation. Ronaldo was talking about how he knows two different sign languages. One of them is the one that he learned at the school in Georgetown, primarily, and the other one is the sign language from his community. They're completely different. Ian and Ronaldo were discussing the different signs that they use for different things here. And they're not related languages, you know, they developed completely distinctly. They have completely different histories. Okay, okay, we're going to switch quickly to Providence Island, Colombia. So in the Western Caribbean here. And this is maybe one of the better known sign languages in the region, in some ways, at least in the research literature, because there was research on this language starting in the 1970s. And the situation in Providence is quite similar to the one that we just saw in Guyana, in Falmouth, in that there's genetic deafness in the community. In fact, in this community, there are two different genes for deafness. So there are quite a number of people who are deaf in the community, not all of whom are related to each other. And again, and hopefully not surprisingly anymore, as sign language has emerged in the community, deaf people and hearing people sign. This is a picture of some research. Again, you can see Ian here doing some research with deaf people in the community in Providence on trying to understand that language, understand its structure and its history. And this led to a really great project conducted by Rahana Omardeen, who is Trini, who not long ago completed her PhD in linguistics, working on this language, and she did a language documentation project where she recorded signers from all over Providence, recorded the language as much as she could, recorded conversations, and studied how the language worked, what its structure was like. And all of those recordings are deposited in an archive. One of the reasons for doing that kind of work is that sign language endangerment is a huge issue. Many sign languages, almost all sign languages around the world, are under threat in one way or another. I won't go into all of the complications of this. I have published an article about this if anyone is interested in understanding sign language endangerment, but it's a result partly of the spread of big international sign languages. So the spread of American Sign Language has really put pressure on Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, for example. In Providence, Colombian Sign Language has come into the community, and there are some people there who are switching from Providence Sign Language to Colombian Sign Language. As we saw with Ronaldo, two sign languages is not a problem, not necessarily a problem. It doesn't need to lead to a language disappearing. It's not a case of pick one. Just as with spoken languages, it's perfectly possible to be bilingual, to be multilingual, and multilingualism is not in itself a problem. But sometimes we know that there can be language attitudes which accompany a multilingual situation and which view one language as superior to another, one language as having more worth than the other, one language maybe being suitable for use in schools or other similar settings, and the other language not being appropriate for that, not being up to the job for that. These kind of language attitudes are really the cause of the decline sometimes of certain languages in favor of others. So the work of documenting and archiving these languages and these histories, these cultures, these stories, I think is really important, partly because they're threatened in various different ways. Okay, now quickly, I'm going to talk about a community in the Bay Islands. So the Bay Islands, in particular, I'm going to be talking about people living in Roatan and Guanaja or Bonaca. Bonaca is like the Creole name for it. And in these communities, it's quite similar to the two communities we've just seen in Falmouth and in Providence, in that there is genetic deafness in these communities. But unlike the other two communities, the genes in this community are associated with a condition called Usher syndrome. And with Usher syndrome, people are born with this particular variant of Usher syndrome. People are born deaf, and their sight declines as they get older until they may not be able to see at all. So in this community for, I don't know, 130 years, there have been people who are deaf, deafblind, living in the community. And as with all of those other cases, what happens? Well, people just communicate, and a language emerges as a result of that. And because there are deafblind people in this community, that language is accessible via touch. So it's a tactile language. This is really the first example in the world of a language of this particular kind, of a tactile language that's known to have emerged in a community like this, without any deaf institutions, without any deaf schools, without any deaf associations, without any interventions of any kind. This tactile language just emerged out of this particular community. And I'll show you a very short clip here, just so you can get an idea of what it's like. On the left of your screen is Joseph, who is deaf and has limited vision. And on the right of your screen is Florence, who is his aunt, who is deaf and completely blind. And this is just a little snippet. So in doing research in this community, what we found was that there is this language can be used in a tactile modality, used through touch. It's been used for over 100 years. Again, it's not just deafblind people and deaf-sighted people who use it, but hearing people as well, friends, family, neighbors. It's used quite widely within a particular community. I'll just give you a couple of examples of signs in the language, maybe for fun. So first I'm going to show you the sign that means Monday. And in this video, we have Stella on the left here. She's deaf and blind. She lives in the same village in Roatan as Joseph does, Joseph on the right there. And Stella is deaf and blind. And what she's signing is Monday. And then the video on the right, she's signing Tuesday. Now, one reaction that I've noticed people often have, people when they see signs for the first time, they will often ask, so why is it signed like that? What does that mean? Why is that Monday? Why is that Tuesday? And I think that quite often we don't necessarily have answers to those questions. You know, if you think about words in spoken languages, the word dog, why is the word for a barking animal dog, not something else? Well, there are historical reasons. You can trace back the history of the word over generations and centuries and look at the sound change and all of that. But there's no particular correspondence between the sound of that word dog and a barking animal. And in sign languages, that's sometimes true. Sometimes the signs in a sign language may not have any obvious visual connection to what they represent, what they mean. Although in this particular case, I can give you explanations for the meaning of how these come to mean Monday and Tuesday. So the sign for Monday there, this comes from the fact that traditionally in this community, they would they wash their clothes on a scrubbing board on Mondays. So that's what you do on Mondays. And then on Tuesdays, maybe you can guess what you do on Tuesdays. On Tuesdays, you do the ironing. You iron your clothes. So that's Tuesday. So I think this is always important to remember when talking about any kind of language, that a language is not just a way of communicating. I mean, it's that, and that's, you know, that's a absolute need for all human beings. But it's also much more than that. A language will encode the culture and the history, the practices of a community. It will tell you so much about daily life in a community. Sometimes it will tell you about what daily life was like some generations ago when the word was first coined. An example of this that I liked was Florence's sign for phone, telephone, was like this, was like that. So based on my grandparents had one of those old-fashioned telephones where you have the bit you speak into here and the bit that you listen to here. So yeah, I think we should always remember that sometimes I don't know, I think sometimes I've seen in official discussions around accessibility and things like that, that sign languages are viewed as tools for access. And they are tools for access, but that's not all they are. It's not just about access. It's about so much more. It's about connection to a community, to a history, to a culture, to people, to ancestors. And all of that is part of what you have with the language. And all of that is what you stand to lose if a language disappears. In Guanaja, this picture is, so we were on Roatan in the last slide. We're now in the neighboring island of Guanaja. And in the picture there is, in the blue t-shirt, is David, Florence's husband. He's deaf, but not blind. And he was the only beekeeper in Guanaja. And that means he's the only producer of honey. So if you wanted honey and you live in Guanaja, you have to go to David. And we spent a day walking around Guanaja with David. He carried a bucket full of bottles of honey, sold it to people all around the island. And what we saw was that everyone that he met would sign with him. They would have a conversation with him in this sign language. So again, it's not just deaf people, not just deaf blind people using this language, but hearing people too. And it was culturally very normal. So again, we worked on producing as rich as possible a kind of documentation of this language. We recorded about 30 hours worth of conversations about all kinds of topics, and we archived those recordings in an international archive. So taking a step back now, I've given you some case studies of specific situations, taking a step back and looking at the Caribbean as a whole. Well, what do we see? What we see is a very complex situation. The green stars on this map represent those kind of rural sign languages, the ones like the one in Falmouth or the one in the Bay Islands. And you can see that these are very common. They appear in quite a few places on the map. I believe from talking to a colleague in Puerto Rico, there are probably 2 in Puerto Rico. I've talked to colleagues who said there's at least 1 or 2 in the Dominican Republic. I'm sure in other parts of the Caribbean, there are more. I've seen this in Bequia, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and in Union Island. So there's a really huge amount of variety of signing traditions in the Caribbean. As far as I'm concerned, there is no single Caribbean sign language. There are many, many, many different sign languages, and these are only some of them. The influence of international languages like American Sign Language is definitely, that has an effect, depending on people's backgrounds, where they come from, and their age. Quite a few people might be familiar with some variety of American Sign Language because it's just been so influential in the region. But of course, colonial relationships have also had an influence. So in the French colonies, French Sign Language is used. In the Dutch colonies and former colonies, Sign Language of the Netherlands is used. You have sign languages from the mainland, like Honduran Sign Language, Nicaraguan Sign Language, Colombian Sign Language, finding their way into islands in the Caribbean too. And for me, it's very important to stress that in many parts of the Caribbean, sign languages have not been documented at all. So there's so much that we still don't know. And Grenada is one example. I've done a small amount of work there. So I'm going to try to wrap up quickly. I'm a little behind schedule. I suppose we did start a little late. I believe that if we don't pay attention to this diversity, it has negative social consequences. We have to understand, not simplify, and respect this sign language diversity. So I've got a short clip here from Paula, who is a deaf person from Trinidad. And you see there that what she says is that she finds American Sign Language difficult to understand, but TTSL or Trinidad Sign Language, she understands everything. And this matters because, let's say, in terms of the provision of interpreting services and TV6 and press conferences, you'll see an interpreter often in a box, usually a far too small box, sometimes a box that cuts off. If you don't have a widescreen TV. And if that interpreter is using American Sign Language, there may be people like Paula who don't understand that. And at the same time, if the interpreter is using a very strong version of TTSL, there may be younger people who are more comfortable with American Sign Language who don't understand that as well. So we have to consider this diversity when we're thinking about social issues and we're thinking about issues of access. We have to draw on these resources that we have in the Caribbean. So an example from Providence Island here. My video seems to have frozen. Okay, I think it's unfrozen now. So this, in the picture here, there's a boy from Providence, a deaf boy, and he went to a speech therapist who recommended him for a cochlear implant. And after he had the cochlear implant, his mother was told that he shouldn't sign, he should just focus on developing speech, despite the fact that he lived in a place where there was this long sign language tradition, where hearing and deaf people could sign quite widely, and yet he was prevented from signing. And this can have catastrophic consequences. If a child is growing up and growing up and growing up and doesn't develop language, then they will suffer. It will have consequences for their lifetime. They'll experience something called language deprivation syndrome. So drawing on the resources that we have, the linguistic resources, the different languages that exist, is really important for social matters. And I'm going to be quite frank, I think that formal deaf education in the Caribbean has been a disaster on the whole, and that is because of repeated attempts to import foreign methods, foreign solutions that don't fit the Caribbean situation. So instead of importing oralist teaching methods from England, instead of importing American Sign Language from the US, I think we can do things differently if we draw from what we have. If we stop thinking in terms of deficits, in terms of lacks, if we stop simplifying, if we see the richness and the uniqueness of deaf Caribbean experiences and knowledges, often, as in the development of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, forged in resistance to oppressive systems which tried to keep them down, tried to prevent them from signing, we can draw from this abundance. How can we do that? Well, a couple of simple examples. This is some work from Providence Island, where in the first stage, we can document signs, working with deaf signers. We can produce illustrations like this for resources, and then we can bring those resources into settings like schools. Here we have a deaf person from Providence in the school in Providence, and he's teaching that sign to the kids in the school. So drawing on what is already there in Providence, in terms of the people, in terms of their languages. Same thing in Falmouth. So we can do documentation work with the community. We can elicit signs and structures and grammars. We can produce resources like this very simple dictionary. And then that can be put to use. Dictionaries are useful partly because they're symbolic, because when you can show somebody a dictionary, they will believe that your language exists, and they might consider recognizing it, and they might consider taking steps to provide you with access in it. In this particular community, whilst we were in the community, we witnessed people having difficulty accessing healthcare, accessing the police, accessing education, because the language was not recognized. We can use technology to produce electronic resources. So this is an example of a kind of basic dictionary. You can click on the left, and then you'll see the sign that corresponds to that English word come up in the video. It's simple, and it's quite simple to produce, and it can have some social impact, I think, potentially. This is a prototype augmented reality app that we developed, where you can go from a paper document with pictures on to animations. So this could be useful if you produce a paper dictionary, which, as I say, can be very symbolically important. You can put it together with this app so that you can actually see how the sign moves. So you point your phone at the picture, and the picture animates. So combining the linguistic resources that we already have, the expertise and the knowledge and the culture and the history, with new technologies can be powerful. One more example of this. These are some bilingual or multilingual, in some cases, storybooks, where what you have is a TTSL signer next to text in either English or Spanish in one case. And what this does is it can provide access to stories, access to sign language, tools for teaching literacy, tools for providing information to deaf young people, could be used for deaf adults as well. And I'll just show you what this looks like. So you can watch this on your phone or your tablet or your computer or whatever. My last point, I will stop. Deaf people have to lead in this work. They have to lead in producing the resources. Those videos all feature deaf people signing, but also deciding what resources are needed. In leadership of organizations, sadly, doesn't happen enough. In advocacy, and most relevant to my life, in research. So actually this month, we started a project in partnership with a university in the UK, creating a network of deaf academics in Trinidad and Tobago, in Jamaica, and in Puerto Rico. And the idea is to support deaf people to develop their own research agendas, carry out their own research, get mentoring, get training, get support, get resources, get money. And I feel that this is how we can go forward, where we can use the kind of knowledge that we have in universities, the kind of resources we have, to create socially useful, impactful stuff. And I've got far too many people that I ought to thank, because all of this work is collaborative. But I'll just show some pictures and stop. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ben. I am overwhelmed. I am emotional after your presentation. The value of what you're doing is so absolutely important. So at this point, we are going to take some questions. I think some persons had to leave, but so you can either type it into the chat if you wish, or if you wish to unmute your mic, put up your hand and then I'll call on you and unmute your mic to speak. So over to the audience if anyone has any questions. Wait, hold on. I think. Okay, so Breezy, I see your, well, we have some, what is it, compliments in the chat, right? Thanks for presenting your research very comprehensively and very enlightening presentation. Thank you very much. I have heard about ASL, CSL, but did not know there were so many other sign languages. Amazing. All right, Breezy, do you have a question? You can go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I heard it the best that I could. I have two sick girls at home, so. But I do have a question that has intrigued me a lot, and it's related to our work on CAI, on Caribbean Astronomy for Inclusion. For example, we know that there is, well, we learned that there is a lot of different languages throughout the Caribbean, and each country has their own language. And if I understood correctly, some of those languages are based on ASL, so they might understand ASL, but I learned today that a lot of them, I mean, people don't necessarily understand ASL, even though they're based in the Caribbean. Within the same country, you may have different languages, so it's difficult to communicate. What do you say would be the best way for us when we want to communicate, in our case, some astronomy, let's say an outreach talk? Sometimes we have that, and we, when possible, trying to include an interpreter, or even this talk, if we have an interpreter, what is the best way to be able to reach everyone? Do we use ASL?
Yeah.
Do we have to only focus in a certain area?
Yeah. Well, what I would, my recommendation would be, I think what people do quite a lot, an example of this is the news in Trinidad, where they have an interpreter and they feel that that is a solution to the issue of accessibility. And what the deaf community says is that's not actually a solution to accessibility. It looks like it, but it's an illusion of inclusion, if you will. And I think that the better way of doing it is that interpreter is likely to be a hearing person. So the deaf community is not directly involved in the intervention. I think what we need to do is work directly with deaf people. So, for example, if what you want to do is bring astronomy to deaf communities, which is a beautiful and wonderful thing, then connect with deaf organizations, connect with deaf leaders directly. They may not be the ones teaching in the schools. They may not be the ones in charge of the national associations, but connect with those people, and they will know how to navigate their own community, how to navigate the different language differences that there are. Deaf people are extremely skilled and talented at overcoming linguistic barriers. You saw my colleague Ian there when he was interviewing Ronaldo. He's switching between languages very easily. He hadn't been in contact with that community for very long, but he picked it up extremely quickly, and he was navigating those differences. So I think if you go with deaf people in the front, maybe you provide training to deaf leaders who are interested in supporting what you're trying to do, if they see the value of what you're trying to do, and you can bring them on board and you can provide training to them, and then they can lead the dissemination efforts within their own communities. I think that that's the best way of doing it.
Okay, so there are two questions in the chat, and after that, Yasmin will take you. One is from Vindra. Does history and research consider the Cascade School for the Deaf, the institution, to be the originator of TTSL, or should it be the students themselves?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. What I think is it's the students themselves. They did it in the face of violence, from the institution. The institution didn't want them to sign. The institution punished them physically if they signed. So I think institutionally speaking, you can say that the institution created the circumstances. If there wasn't that deaf school, if there wasn't that dormitory, if there wasn't that space for people to interact, the language wouldn't exist. But I think it's important to recognize those children in that picture, those people in that picture. They need to get the credit, I think. And I say this partly, for me, it's quite an emotional thing to talk about, because those people are dying. A number of the older people whose videos I showed you are no longer alive, and they haven't been recognized in their lifetime for this amazing achievement, creating a whole culture and a whole language out of nothing as a child. I mean, what a thing to do. What a thing to do. So for me, I think those people should be celebrated and recognized for what they are, for what they did. And I think there's often this conflict between the institutions that are responsible for disabled people helping, for supporting or whatever, and the disabled people themselves. Certainly within deaf communities, I think there is a big divide between what the deaf community wants and what the institutions think they want. And so, yeah, for me, for kind of moral reasons more than anything else, I think that we should view those people, those students, those people, those adults as the originators.
Speaking on a personal note, you have brought such a different perspective to me. And as you say, ASL is so pervasive. I do have a personal interest. And if I want to learn a word, I go to YouTube and it is ASL. And I mean, losing our indigenous languages is really painful. There's another question here, and then we will go to Yasmin after. This is from Deva Sharma. He's asking, how does STEM, which will be science, technology, engineering, mathematics in the Caribbean accommodate for the disabled, deaf and blind students, if you're aware?
It's a tough question for me to answer, partly because I can't answer for the whole of the Caribbean. I mean, I said before in the talk that I think that deaf education has been a disaster, a catastrophe. That's my honest opinion about that. And I think that it hasn't accommodated disabled people well at all. I think there's quite a lot of variation in different places. You know, so in Puerto Rico, for example, there are some benefits there from the fact that certain legislation passed in the States is implemented in some ways in Puerto Rico. In the French Caribbean, the French deaf education system is implemented in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and that has some benefits. But on the whole, and I can't really speak about blind students, but on the whole, I would say for deaf students, certainly in Trinidad and Tobago, they're barely accommodated. Their expectations are extremely low. And there's a lot of work to be done. Sorry for the depressing answer.
Yeah, it's very actually important for us to hear it as it is. As I say, it's very eye-opening for me, and I think for all of us who are here. All right, Yasmin, you want to unmute? You can go ahead now.
Are you hearing me, Shireen?
Yes, we're hearing you well.
Well, Shireen, for one thing, thank you very much for inviting me and sending me this link. Dr. Braithwaite, I am absolutely stunned by your presentation. I really never given a thought to the deaf because I've had very little opportunities to deal with deaf people. I've always lived with the so-called normal people. The question I had in mind, or I have in mind, is how do you teach a deaf child a musical instrument?
Well, quite a lot of deaf people I know in Trinidad learned pan at school, and that's, I imagine it's not very different teaching a deaf child to teaching a hearing child how to play pan. There's a lot of variation in the levels of hearing somebody may have and the frequencies at which they may hear. So some people may be able to hear certain frequencies and you can use that. Some people may not. Instruments that are percussive, I think, are particularly good. You might know there's a famous percussionist, Evelyn Glennie, who's deaf, and percussive instruments, you know, they involve the body and touch and feel and vibration a lot. And those kind of instruments, I think there's not really any barrier to deaf people using them. Deaf people at the School for the Deaf, dancing is very popular. I know quite a few deaf dancers. You might have seen, this kind of thing is always happening, but in the Super Bowl the other day, there was a deaf interpreter who interpreted Rihanna's performance in the Super Bowl halftime show. So that's a kind of deaf musical performance where the song is signed. So there's lots of different ways. I think one of the things you have to consider is the person you're working with. What's their level of hearing? What's their interest? And the barriers might be more in all kinds of education. I think often the barriers are expectation and motivation. If people have low expectations of you, then you might live down to those expectations. And if people are not motivated, they're not likely to learn. But once you bring enthusiasm, inspiration, and once you have high expectations, I don't think there's any problem.
Thank you. And the second question is, how can people volunteer to offer assistance? Because from what I'm hearing, there's a great need for more integration and community involvement with the deaf community in Trinidad and Tobago. What suggestions can you make to a lot of us who are retired now might be able to participate or to contribute? Any ideas?
Yeah, well, I think in answering that, I'll touch on something that Shireen said as well, which was maybe you want to learn some signs, you look on YouTube and you're just seeing ASL. And yeah, that's true. But the thing is, if you really want to learn to sign, you have to be off the internet. You have to meet some deaf people. I mean, that's the only way to learn to sign. You can't learn to sign from YouTube. You can learn some signs, but you won't be able to put them together, and you won't be able to understand someone as soon as they start signing at you. So the answer is, if you're interested in deaf communities, get involved in deaf community events. I would recommend in Trinidad and Tobago, there's an organization called the Deaf Empowerment and Advancement Foundation. I can send a link later on if you want to circulate that.
Sure.
But that's a deaf-led organization. The leadership is entirely deaf. It is formed by the people who actually produced the dictionary. We did a lot of the work on the dictionary. They didn't write the introduction, the wrong introduction, but they did the work on documenting their language. And they have a lot of stuff. They're doing a lot of stuff. I think you have to learn to sign. Like, there's no way around that. If you want to be involved in the deaf community, you know, that's my experience coming here and wanting to do research. I didn't publish anything for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years because I didn't feel I could represent a community whose language I wasn't proficient in. I didn't feel that that was ethical, and I also didn't feel that I could understand what was going on if I didn't understand it myself. So I think you have to really invest time in it and invest yourself in it. I remember my grandmother, who's now 100 years old, but when she was a spring chicken of about 85, she decided, I think because I was into sign language stuff, she decided she wanted to help out in her local deaf community in London. And she contacted a local deaf organization and said, I want to help you. And the deaf people responded and said, well, I don't think there's anything you can do for us. Thanks anyway. And she was very upset and offended by that. But it's kind of reasonable. I mean, honestly, deaf people, the deaf people living near her there wasn't really anything that she could do for them. I mean, if she's interested, she could learn to sign, but they don't need her help. So for me, it's a matter of getting involved in the community, making friends, having meaningful relationships with people. And then they might tell you, oh, could you do this for me? Like, can you help me out filling out this form? Or could you come and interpret for this appointment I have at an office or at a doctor or whatever, that kind of thing. But I think it all depends on, you really got to sign first.
Okay,
thank you, Yasmin. Very, very important questions. And we'll take these as the last one. So we have from Vindra, was oralism and autism very much a practice in the Caribbean, and does it still occur today? He suggests it still seems to, but we want to hear your perspective, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One thing I would say about this is, I think that oralism, so that oralism and autism means discriminating against people on the basis of whether they can hear or not. So discriminating against deaf people because they can't hear. And oralism means favoring spoken language over signed languages. And I think that oralism is an imported ideology, not a Caribbean ideology. If you go to communities, you know, like the ones that I've talked about, the hearing people sign. They don't have a problem with sign language. They don't have a problem with deaf people either. They don't try to make them speak. They create sign languages, and they have accessible systems in place that they created themselves based on their needs and their experiences. And I think that those ideologies have been imported from elsewhere, and I think it's important to say that. I do agree, yeah, definitely, it's still is prevalent. It's happening in different ways now. So I gave you that example of the cochlear implant, the boy with the cochlear implant in Providence, and cochlear implants are becoming more and more common in the Caribbean as they are in the world. And that doesn't have to be a problem. Many deaf people who I speak to in the Caribbean are very against cochlear implants because they see it as an intervention designed to basically eugenics, an intervention designed to wipe deaf people off the face of the earth. And I think they have legitimate concerns around that. On the other hand, I can't see a world in which cochlear implants are not going to continue to be used and probably expand in their use. And it's perfectly possible for deaf people with cochlear implants to be bilingual, to have a deaf identity as well as being a person who uses speech. So there's no necessary contradiction there. The problem is, I think, if we have professionals working in that area who themselves have internalized audist or oralist ideologies. So if we have, as in Providence, speech therapists who say, do not learn to sign. If you learn to sign, your speech will be delayed. It's scientifically wrong, in fact. As a linguist, it's very obvious to me that if you're trying to learn a second language, you better have a first one. If you're learning speech, helps to have a first language, and sign language is right there. It's accessible. Learn that first, and you can build your knowledge of a second language on top of that. So yeah, I think audism and oralism does exist, and there's a lot of spicy talk I could engage in about this, but I think this might be going out on YouTube, so I better hold back a little bit.
Don't worry, we will do our edits as needed. Ben, at this point, let me take the opportunity to thank you from our hearts. I know I speak on behalf of everybody here, those of us that are here right now, that you have actually in the last hour changed our perspective. And it is like such a gap, and we need people like you to bridge the gap between hearing folks like us who don't understand the intricacies that you have brought to us. I was smiling right through the presentation part where you showed the person who was doing the Trinidadian language, and I could understand what she was saying, not saying a word. It is so obvious. And I had to smile. And you're right, that's the beauty of it. We don't want to lose it. So I want to thank you very much. And for everybody who's here, it will be posted on YouTube. I will send the link to you, as well as for the society that you mentioned to us, for anyone who wants to continue to work with them. And of course, in the chat, we have right, that this was a very moving presentation. Thank you from the bottom of our heart for doing this, Ben. Thank you. All right, folks.
The bottom of mine too. I really appreciate people coming and listening to me speak, that using the time of their day to do that. I really appreciate it. And